Picture a stretch of Baltic coastline roughly 55 centuries ago. Grey water, a biting wind coming off the sea, seal colonies hauled out on distant skerries, and a scatter of hide and timber shelters clustered just above the tide line. A short walk inland, across flat, cleared ground. Smoke rises from a very different kind of settlement. Timber longhouses, penned livestock, furrows cut fresh into the soil. Two communities separated by less distance than a modern commute, living two completely different lives. One had thrown its lot in with the soil, the other had thrown its lot in with the sea, and would go on doing exactly that for the next 1,200 years, defying almost everything we assume about how prehistoric Europe was supposed to work. Today, archaeologists know the people of that second settlement as the Pitted Ware Culture, and for a very long time, nobody actually understood who they were. Their world stretched along the southern edge of Scandinavia from roughly 3500 to 2300 BCE. The Swedish coast, the scattered islands of Denmark, pockets of southern Norway. Chronologically, they sit almost at the doorstep of the Bronze Age, but they were nothing of the sort. They were a holdover, a late Neolithic population that simply refused to give up hunting and gathering at a moment when farming had already swallowed up nearly every other corner of the continent. And they didn't do this in some remote, untouched wilderness. They did it a few kilometers from the fields of the Funnelbeaker culture, a farming society occupying the very same landscape. Two economies, one strip of coastline over 1,000 years of overlap. The name itself comes from their pottery, not from any pits dug into the earth. Compared to earlier hunter-gatherer groups in the region, these people made and used ceramics on a much larger scale, and their vessels carried a distinctive decoration, small pitted impressions pressed in careful rows into the wet clay before firing. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. For most of the 20th century, pottery was treated by archaeologists as something close to a diagnostic marker of farming societies, specifically part of a bundled Neolithic package assumed to arrive alongside fields, livestock, and permanent villages. So when researchers found sophisticated pottery sitting right next to a hunter-gatherer toolkit in settlements a stone's throw from farming villages, one particular theory started to look almost obvious. Maybe, the thinking went, these weren't hunter-gatherers at all. Maybe they were a splinter group of Funnelbeaker farmers who had, for some reason lost to time, abandoned their fields and drifted back to the coast to relearn an older way of life. It wasn't a baseless guess. Pig bones, an unambiguously domesticated animal, turned up at several pitted ware sites, and there was solid evidence of regular trade between the two groups. Put those two facts together, and the failed farmers theory looked, for decades, like a done deal. Then ancient DNA analysis arrived, and quietly took the whole theory apart. The technique involves extracting and sequencing whatever genetic material has survived inside old bones and teeth, sometimes thousands of years old, and over the last 2 decades it has rewritten entire chapters of European prehistory that archaeologists thought were already settled. When geneticists finally got usable samples from pitted ware skeletons, the results left no room for ambiguity. These people were not descendants of Funnelbeaker farmers. They were a genetically distinct, closely related population whose ancestry reached back thousands of years earlier, to the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had lived across Scandinavia long before agriculture ever showed up. While farming was steadily erasing hunter-gatherer populations across the rest of the continent, this particular group hadn't merely survived. They had held their own directly alongside the farmers pressing in on their territory. Genetically, they also turned out to be close cousins of the Pitted Ware people further east around the Baltic, another population that had stretched the old Mesolithic way of life for an unusually long time. What allowed them to pull this off was a specific inherited genetic mix combined with a genuine talent for adapting to a harsh environment. Genetically, the Pitted Ware people were a blend of two much older hunter-gatherer lineages: the Western hunter-gatherers, whose ancestry runs across Ice Age and early post-Ice Age Western Europe, and the Eastern hunter-gatherers, tracing back toward the forests and steppe of Eastern Europe and Russia. The genetic data even preserves the direction that mixing traveled in. Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry shows up most strongly along the western side of Scandinavia, consistent with a slow eastern migration that crept in along Norway's northern coastline. From their western ancestors, these people inherited strikingly pale blue eyes. From their eastern ancestors, unusually pale skin, a combination that happened to suit a life spent surrounded by ice and snow almost perfectly. Worth clarifying, since the two sometimes get confused, none of this connects to the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, whose ancestors arrived from the east in a completely separate, much later migration. Thousands of years in that climate left a physical mark that went beyond coloring. Generation by generation, their bodies adjusted to the cold with real precision. Their lower leg bones grew comparatively shorter, and their noses grew slightly narrower. Both changes that help a body retain heat in punishing conditions. Physically, they were built for endurance, muscular, sturdy, and tough in a way that few contemporary populations could match. A fair share of what we think of today as a classic Scandinavian appearance actually traces back to this ancient hunting population. But the clearest thing separating them from their neighbors wasn't in their bones or their genes. It was in how they actually spent their days, and in a relationship with the open ocean that bordered on the sacred. That relationship with the sea sat at the absolute center of who they were. Neighboring peoples may well have thought of them as something close to seal folk, sea hunters whose entire existence had been built on the wealth the ocean provided. Seal hunting anchored everything. They hunted seals constantly, used seal meat and blubber both for trade and for daily survival, and wore warm sealskin clothing to get through winters cold enough to kill an unprepared person within hours. That marine bounty, especially the fat reserves carried by sea mammals, was an enormous nutritional advantage. Rich enough that Pitted Ware communities sustained a population density normally associated only with farming societies, something almost unheard of among hunter-gatherer groups anywhere in the world. Beyond seals, they took porpoises and whales, and fished the deep water as a matter of course. Their willingness to cross the Baltic Sea, the Skagerrak, and the Kattegat says everything about how thoroughly they'd mastered the ocean, because these are not gentle waters. Strong currents, sudden weather, and long stretches with no land in sight make all three genuinely hazardous, even with modern instruments. They crossed them anyway, in wooden log boats built by hand, and the handful of these vessels archaeologists have actually recovered show a level of construction skill that was, for the period, remarkably advanced, clearly the product of a long, refined boat-building tradition, rather than lucky improvisation. Their skill on open water went well past simply staying afloat. They read the sea the way a farmer reads soil or weather, sensing the pull of a current and the height and rhythm of a wave, using all of it alongside the stars overhead to steer clear of hidden sandbars and dangerous shoals and land exactly where they meant to. Historians believe entire communities likely moved together with the seasons, and the archaeological record backs this up. Different sites show clear signs of occupation at different points in the year. Winter may have pushed them inland, into the shelter of the forest, while the rest of the year drew them back to open coastline. Around the annual seal hunting season specifically, whole communities probably gathered at particular favored locations where a large catch could be processed efficiently together. Still, nomadic isn't quite the right word. Each group or clan appears to have held a defined territory of its own, and differences in tool styles and craftsmanship between groups suggest a genuine sense of ownership over local resources. The best stretches of coastline were almost certainly worth competing for, and there's every reason to think that competition occasionally turned tense, even within their own ranks. As central as the sea was, they were every bit as capable on land. Deep in the forests, they hunted red deer, wild boar, and elk with real skill, and set carefully designed traps for smaller game, pine marten, otter, squirrel, wildcat, prized above all for their fur. They gathered wild greens and fruit and cut timber from those same forests for houses and boats alike. Their main hunting weapon was the bow, but for marine prey they switched to sharpened bone harpoons and spears. For fishing, they used hooks as well as large stone-weighted nets, real evidence of technical sophistication built up over generations. Daily tools included knives, arrowheads, and axes worked from slate and flint. Slate is a relatively soft, easily fractured stone, and yet properly worked and sharpened, it can hold an edge that's surprisingly effective. The fact that these people could reliably turn soft stone into functional cutting tools says something about how intimately they understood the raw material sitting all around them, an understanding that's genuinely hard to appreciate from a modern vantage point. That intimate understanding of their environment didn't stop at the practical. It clearly shaped their inner world too, their sense of meaning, and the unseen forces they believed moved through everything around them. We obviously can't reconstruct the precise beliefs of people who lived 5,000 years ago with much certainty, but excavated ritual sites offer some genuinely compelling clues. At one such site, archaeologists uncovered a striking concentration of bear and elk bones. And curiously, the bones that turned up most often were paws and skulls, specifically, not the rest of the skeleton. That unusual pattern points toward a fairly specific interpretation. During ceremonies, these communities may have used whole animal hides still attached at the head and feet, effectively wearing or displaying the complete silhouette of the animal rather than just its pelt. It isn't hard to picture the scene this suggests. A great fire cutting through the dark of a winter night, elk meat roasting over the flames, and someone draped in a bear's hide moving through some kind of trance or invocation near the fire's edge, maybe a shaman or a similarly designated figure, while a hide drum and a bone flute kept up a steady, piercing rhythm underneath it all. As a fundamentally animist people, they appear to have believed that everything around them, every animal, every plant, every river, carried its own spirit. To secure help or protection in the physical world, they reached out to the spirits of their ancestors and to these unseen natural forces, some of which they regarded as benevolent and some of which they clearly considered dangerous. Keeping the more hostile spirits at bay or appeasing them outright likely involved specific songs, the burning of particular plants, and a whole range of practices we can only partially reconstruct from what survives in the ground. Beyond survival and belief, they also had to navigate an entirely different kind of pressure, their neighbors. Centuries of these two very different economies sitting side by side make for one of the more genuinely interesting chapters in early European history. The two groups traded extensively. Pitted ware hunters brought valuable sealskin, meat, oil, and furs from wild game to exchange with the farmers, receiving polished stone axes and other farming goods in return. The archaeologist Stephen Mithen, in his book After the Ice, sketches a small, vivid version of exactly this kind of exchange. A hunter arriving at a forest clearing with a basket of pine marten pelts to meet a farmer. The two of them speaking entirely different languages and completing the trade purely through gesture and expression. That relationship wasn't strictly commercial either. It's entirely plausible that some of these encounters occasionally grew into family ties as well. But the fuller picture was rarely so peaceful. As pitted ware communities grew more established, Funnelbeaker farmers appear to have grown increasingly uneasy about them, and farming villages began building solid timber palisades around their settlements and fields, a clear sign that raiding happened with some regularity, rather than as an occasional exception. The archaeological record leaves little room to romanticize this as some idealized coexistence. At least 10% of recovered pitted ware skeletons show signs of serious traumatic injury, evidence of violence severe enough to have killed. Bone doesn't preserve every kind of wound, so the true rate of violent death was almost certainly higher than that number implies. Round stone mace heads favored by the farmers and lethal antler clubs crafted by the hunters are physical evidence, even now, of that ongoing friction. Abduction, sudden raids, bloody skirmishes were all probably fairly routine. And despite all those centuries of proximity and regular trade, genetic mixing between the two populations stayed remarkably minimal. Even the very last pitted ware skeletons recovered from Gotland show only a trace amount of farmer DNA. That genetic isolation tells its own story. These groups clearly did business with one another, but when it came to family and community, they held a hard, deliberate line. Funnelbeaker farmers were eventually pushed into such a difficult position across parts of this territory that many communities abandoned their settlements entirely and relocated elsewhere. But this hunting culture's dominance wasn't going to last forever either, because barreling in from the east was an entirely new population, considerably more aggressive, and it was about to permanently rewrite Scandinavia's future. Around 2800 BCE, a massive wave of change swept across Europe. A forceful, expansionist population began moving in from the Eurasian steppe, a group archaeologists call the Pitted Ware Culture, named for the cord-like impressions pressed into their pottery. A local branch of that same culture took root in southern Scandinavia and became known there as the Battle-Axe culture. These mobile herders completely upended a demographic balance that had held across Europe for 1,000 years. They displaced the old Funnelbeaker farmers at remarkable speed, and in settling the land, mixed with them to form an entirely new society. The combination of Funnelbeaker collapse and Battle-Axe ascendance threw the whole region into real instability. And yet, here's the genuinely surprising part. The resilient pitted ware hunters didn't simply bow to these new arrivals either. They held their ground against the Battle-Axe culture for roughly another 500 years, running in parallel right alongside them. It would be easy to assume the newcomers from the steppe were physically massive, the farmers comparatively soft, and the hunters, living on wild food alone, smaller or weaker by comparison. That assumption turns out to be largely wrong. Look at the actual skeletal structure and DNA of all three groups, and the physical gap between them wasn't nearly as dramatic as we might expect. The steppe herders genuinely were tall, broad, and powerfully built, and the farmers, by comparison, tended to run a bit shorter and leaner. But the pitted ware hunters were in no way physically inferior. A lifetime spent surviving an unforgiving environment had made them every bit as sturdy, tough, and capable in a fight as anyone else in the region. The explanation for that similarity runs deep into their respective ancestries. Modern genetics shows the steppe herders themselves carried a complicated mix. Eastern hunter-gatherer, Western hunter-gatherer, and Caucasus hunter-gatherer lineages all blended together over thousands of years. Our Scandinavian pitted ware hunters, by contrast, were essentially direct descendants of the Western and Eastern European hunter-gatherer lines, with very little else mixed in. And the Funnelbeaker farmers traced their origins back to Anatolia in modern-day Turkey, carrying genetic ties to the earliest farming populations of the Levant and the wider Near East, along with a bit of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, absorbed somewhere along their long migration into Europe. In other words, despite thousands of years spent developing in wildly different environments under wildly different ways of life, all three populations ultimately traced back to the very same handful of ancient hunter-gatherer lineages, just combined in different proportions. Genetic research into ancient physical traits turns up one more striking detail. The specific combination we now think of as classically Scandinavian, Western-derived blue eyes alongside Eastern-derived fair hair, has its earliest known trace in particular pockets of Scandinavia, Romania, and Anatolia, dating all the way back to roughly 6,500 BCE, regions where ancient populations first began mixing with one another in a meaningful way. For a long stretch after that, right up until the arrival of the globular, amphora, and funnelbeaker cultures, those specific traits actually stayed fairly rare across the wider population. It was the long genetic isolation that followed, which allowed blue eyes and pale skin to become so pronounced and so common specifically among the Pitted Ware people, setting them apart from the battle-axe herders both physically and culturally. As the aggressive newcomers pushed their influence further across Scandinavia, the Pitted Ware hunters showed no interest in handing over their territory, their forests, or their waters without resistance. What followed was a long, largely quiet standoff between two formidable battle-hardened peoples, a contest for survival whose outcome would ultimately decide the future of the entire region. That standoff, stretched across roughly 5 centuries, didn't end in some final decisive battle. By around 2300 BCE, this remarkably persistent hunting culture, one that had held on for nearly 1200 years, finally began to fade. So why, despite all that marine wealth and physical toughness, did the Pitted Ware people ultimately lose ground? The answer comes down almost entirely to population growth. Farming and herding populations tend to grow faster than hunter-gatherer ones for fairly mundane reasons. Softer, cultivated foods let mothers wean children earlier, shortening the gap between births, and a stored, controllable food supply buffers a community against the bad seasons that would otherwise limit how many people a stretch of land can support. Marine hunting gave the Pitted Ware people a genuinely rich diet and let them sustain unusually large numbers for a hunter-gatherer society, but that abundance still had a ceiling. The battle-axe economy, built on farming and herding, simply didn't. Over time, its population grew at a faster and faster rate, while the Pitted Ware hunters found themselves increasingly outnumbered, purely as a matter of arithmetic rather than any failure of skill or courage. Slowly, through a process that was probably far less dramatic than it sounds, these formidable sea hunters were absorbed into the wider battle-axe society. By around 2300 BCE, the old Mesolithic way of life the Pitted Ware culture had carried forward for so long finally came to a close. Set against the rest of European prehistory, this is an almost unbelievably late holdout. In most other regions, the hunter-gatherer era had ended 1,000 years earlier or more, which makes Scandinavia's ability to sustain this ancient lifestyle for so much longer a genuinely remarkable achievement in its own right. And crucially, the Pitted Ware people didn't vanish. The battle-axe culture won out in the end, but it absorbed the blood and the accumulated survival knowledge of these hunters into its own population rather than erasing it outright. That fusion of two completely different ways of life is what eventually gave rise to the celebrated Nordic Bronze Age, a period whose influence would go on to shape an entirely new chapter of European history. Even now, that ancient Pitted Ware blood still runs through the veins of modern Scandinavians. Just as Funnelbeaker genes persisted within the later corded ware and battle-axe populations, Pitted Ware genes wove themselves into that new Bronze Age population too, shaping the generations that followed. Their influence ran deep enough that even after merging completely into a different way of life, their maritime mastery, their seafaring knowledge, and their spiritual mythology left a lasting imprint on the cultures that came after them in Scandinavia. That pull toward open water, that near spiritual bond with the natural world, and that sheer refusal to back down in the face of danger all seem to have carried quietly forward into later Scandinavian life, an inheritance passed down in ways that go well beyond biology alone. Looking back on all of this now, it's hard to see the Pitted Ware people as some primitive footnote from the hunting age. They stand as genuine proof that a society can adapt, endure, and even flourish under conditions that would have broken most other groups. Their story makes one thing clear. The arc of human progress was never only about farming or building cities. Sometimes it ran the other way entirely. A people standing firm against the tide of change and finding a way to thrive anyway, right in the teeth of nature's harshest conditions for 1,200 years longer than anyone had reason to expect.